Let me go back and just recap some of the slides from Lecture 6, and then I'll tell you where we're going to go. In Lecture 6, I talked about how geologists use a variety of tools to explore for mineralization that might intersect the surface of the Earth, and today mineralization that increasingly is buried at greater depths relative to the Earth's surface. So we looked at this cross-section during the last lecture, and just as a reminder, on the left side of the screen, the y-axis is meters above sea level. So this is a prospect in south central Alaska. This is 300 meters above sea level, minus 500 and minus 1,000 meters. Each one of these black lines that you can see starts at the surface, penetrates a different depth across the cross-section, and then each one of the red histograms to the left of each black line is a sense of how much copper is located in that rock, and each one of the blue histograms on the right side of the black line gives you a sense of how much gold is in the rock at that particular location. Now, remember that this is one cross-section into the Earth at the Pebble Prospect. The reality is that the mining company who have been doing exploration here since the late 1980s, they have hundreds of these, and the way that you would actually fully define the volume of the ore deposit would be to stack all of these sections coming out of the screen towards you and going into the screen away from you. And that would give you a really good three-dimensional view of what the gold and copper mineralization looks like at depth. So the question here to prime you is, after you define the resource, after you explore for, find the ore deposit, you know how big the ore body is below the surface, you know how much copper is there, how much gold is there because you've drilled into it, you've measured the amount of copper, you measured the amount of gold. What do you do next? There are a sequence of steps. The first is to do what's called a pre-feasibility economic study. So this is where economics become important. Now that you know you have an ore deposit below that particular place on Earth's surface, the question is, can the ore be mined and processed at a reasonable cost? Remember that all of the cost to this point in time is all negative cash flow. Mining companies have borrowed all of this money in order to do the exploration and get to this point in time. They only start making money after they build the mine, extract the rock, pull out the copper, pull out the gold, and sell that to buyers on the open market. So this pre-feasibility economic study, in essence, is saying, okay, can we build a mine infrastructure, extract that rock, and process it to sell the metals on the open market at what I define here as a reasonable cost? And reasonable has to mean that over the lifetime of the mine, you're selling all the metal at a given price to recover all of your cost, all of the exploration costs, all of the mining costs, all of the marketing costs, all of your human resources, the cost for mining, the health insurance for your employees, the coffee in the break room, you name it. All of those costs have to be recovered by selling the metal. Second, the mining company has to do a feasibility study that includes an environmental impact statement, typically abbreviated as EIS. This, in the case of the Pebble Prospect, is why the mining company has not yet been able to secure the social license to operate, because the environmental impact statement has to be done by a third-party company, not the mining company, but a third-party company for whom it can be demonstrated they are unbiased, and they have to produce an environmental impact statement that satisfies all stakeholders. The local community, meaning people who live near the mine, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency for the state of Alaska in this case. So this environmental impact statement represents another cost to the mining company, but it must be done and it must be able to demonstrate that mining will have as small an environmental footprint as possible. It's never going to have zero footprint because you're digging a big hole in the ground. But you have to be able to demonstrate that the negative environmental impacts will be as close to zero as possible. The cost for this can be enormous. So the cost of a baseline study for an environmental impact statement can be on the order of about half or 50% of all of the exploration costs. to as much as twice or 200% of the exploration costs. And again, these front-end expenses are all negative cash flow, where the mining company is borrowing money to do these environmental impact statements. And then the third is request for permitting to build the mine infrastructure, which must include plans for reclamation of the surface area after mine closure. So that permitting process, you have to be able to document how you're going to construct your mine, and after the end of life of your mine, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, what you're going to do to return that landscape to as close as it was prior to mining, and to make sure that in perpetuity there will be no potential negative environmental impact. And this is where the social license to operate has become incredibly challenging for mining companies around the world. So here are three hypothetical ore deposits. We've got A, B in the center of your screen, and C. And the question I want you to think about now is, how would you extract or mine these three different volumes of rock that have been defined as an ore deposit? A company has done the exploration, they've drilled, they've used magnetometers, they've used conductivity or resistivity, they know the volume of ore deposit under the ground. How would you mine these three deposits? Would you mine them the same way? Would you use different techniques? What would you do? And how does your choice of mining, meaning the type of mining infrastructure you're going to build, how does that affect your economics? So if we look at a hypothetical ore body here labeled A, we've got the ground surface with you and me standing on it. We've got this ore body A. When ore bodies are shaped like this, close to the surface, the mining choice is to build an open pit mine. And I'm going to trace out here with my laser pointer what will become the walls and the base of the open pit mine to extract this particular ore body. And what I want you to see here, and I'll explain over again in the lecture, is you're not only going to extract the A ore body, that's the rock that contains the copper or the gold or the platinum that you can extract and sell. But notice that you also have to extract all the rock above A, between the ore body and the surface, and then you have to extract a lot of rock to the left and to the right of the ore body so that you can build a pit that has walls that are stable enough that you don't risk those walls collapsing during mining operations. Contrast that now with ore body B, where I've rotated the ore body 90 degrees, and notice that now its long direction is perpendicular to the surface of the earth. But also notice here that if you were to mine B as an open pit mine, notice that you have to build your mine deeper, and you also have to excavate a lot more of the rock to the right of B and a lot more of the rock to the left of B, and none of this rock surrounding the ore body has anything that worth selling. So it's only in the ore body B that any metal of significant concentration can be sold, but yet you have to mine all of the rock to the left and all of the rock to the right in order to be able to safely extract the rock that is within ore body B. So now compare the two. We've got A on top and B on bottom. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the example on the top is an economic mine, and the example on the bottom for ore deposit B is an uneconomic mine. And I want you to think about why. The reason that A is economic is that A has a shape that is parallel to the surface of the earth. And you are extracting a lot of rock to the right and to the left and above A. But the overall size of the pit is much smaller relative to the size of the ore body than it is in example B. So notice in example B, we've got an ore body that's vertical. And notice that just looking here at the two-dimensional area on your screen, the actual volume of B is much less than the volume of all of this rock to the right and left that you would have to extract or mine in order to actually access B. So this is directly affecting the economics of mining for whatever company chooses to mine ore body A versus ore body B. In this case, ore body A, a mining company could get capital to mine. In ore body B, there's no way that a mining company could secure capital to mine ore body B because they'd have to mine too much of what we call overburden, and I'll come back and define that. They'd have to mine too much overburden here, this excess rock around the ore body, which makes it not profitable. So here we have two more ore bodies, D and E, and let's assume that these have gold or copper or platinum or some other metal that is valued by society. Which of these is easier to mine and why? So a question now is, would you mine these with an open pit or would you mine these by going underground? And it turns out in this case, a mining company would most likely mine these shapes of ore bodies by building an underground infrastructure. And I'll talk about that today because building an open pit mine is not economic. So here's just a sense of the two ways that mining companies extract ore bodies. I just want you to focus here top left. We've got an ore body here, the Crandon copper zinc deposit in dark gray, and notice that it is very close to intersecting the surface. It has a much greater width or volume closer to the surface, and then it becomes much thinner as a function of depth away from the surface. So this is an example where a mining company would use an open pit to mine near the surface, and then as the ore body gets deeper and deeper and deeper, the mining company will actually transition and build an underground infrastructure to mine the deeper parts of the ore body. And so I want to walk through today how mining companies build open pit mines and how mining companies build underground mines. But I want you up front here just to see why a mining company would choose one versus the other. There's a lot of published literature about open pit mine planning and design, lots of books. There are engineering degree programs around the world that focus on this. So if you have an interest from an engineering perspective, please reach out to me or Google this and you can find tons of stuff on the web that describe the details of how engineers are brought in to plan this type of mine infrastructure. So here we have another cross-section you saw last week when we talked about pebble in lecture 6. And again, all the colors here correspond to concentrations of copper. Pink is the most copper, yellow is the least copper, but all of this is what we call mine grade copper, meaning all of it at current copper prices can be extracted and sold such that the mining company makes a profit after recovering all of their costs, including exploration, including the environmental impact statement. All of those costs can be recovered by selling copper. And notice the gray line here is the shape of the pit that the mining company proposes to dig over 25 years. And then on the east side of the ore body, they would enlarge the pit between 25 and 45 years. And then between 45 and 75 years is this sort of purple line at the base. And notice that the pit gets a little deeper through most of the west side of the ore body, and then really deep on the east side of the ore body. So again, they're projecting out 25, 45, and 78 years. And I just want to let you know now that we have no clue what the price of copper will be 25 years from now, let alone 45 or 78 years from now. So in a future lecture, when I talk about the economics of mining, I'll come back and I'll discuss how challenging it is for mining companies when they're planning a mining operation that could be 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And what they're in essence doing is they're predicting how the price of copper will behave over that time frame, which is really hard. So here's the Bingham Canyon mine, and just as a reminder, mining here began in 1906. Over the last 114 years, they've mined 22 million tons of copper, and they've dug this giant hole to be able to extract those 22 million tons of copper. And currently we use that much copper about every year and a half, just to give you a sense of how many Bingham Canyons we must have around the world to satisfy current copper consumption rates. Now here are some images that I took on a family vacation a few years ago You got to laugh at that one. I know my kids did. But we went to Bingham Canyon when we took a trip to Salt Lake City. And you're looking now at Bingham Canyon before it was ever mined. And this is a cartoon cross-section. And all I want to focus you on, follow my laser pointer. This is the pre-mining surface here. On the right-hand side, we've got elevation in feet above sea level. So Salt Lake City is about 7,000 feet above sea level. So here we're about 6,500, 7,000 feet above sea level. And in yellow, and now I'm tracing with the laser pointer, this was the ore body within yellow in 1906 when they started mining. Okay? So the only rock on the whole screen that contains metals that are worth money is contained within this yellow defined area that is labeled here as the ore body. So watch what happens over the last 114 years. 1906 is when they put the first shovel into the ground. Here we are 1900, and Bingham Canyon is back here. These words say the Upper Bingham Canyon, again named after two brothers, the Bingham brothers, who were Mormon pioneers in the 1840s, and they used to actually graze their cattle in Bingham Canyon when nobody had the foresight to think it would become a mine. So we go from 1900. By 1925, notice what they're doing. They're extracting here, this mined out area, they're extracting only the ore body. None of the rock to the left, none of the rock to the right, only the ore body. By 1930, notice that the topography has changed. Now we've got a topography that indicates, one, you can see the absence of green, the absence of trees, because the mine infrastructure is growing in only 24 years. By 1950, notice with my laser pointer, they've mined out more of the ore body, but look at what also has happened. Now they're mining out the rock to the left of the ore body, which is economically worthless, and they're also mining out rock to the right of the ore body, which is also economically worthless. So right now the question you should have is, why would any mining company waste their money mining this rock to the right and this rock to the left if it's economically worthless? Why don't they only mine the rock in the ore body? Here we are in 1960. You can see a lot less green. The dimensions are the same in each one of these photographs, and the mine is growing larger and larger and larger. By 1975, notice that more of the ore body has been extracted, and a lot more of this overburden, or rock that contains no metals of economic interest, a lot more of this overburden to the left and the right is being mined out. By 1990, this is what the pit looked like only 30 years ago, and this is the mined out area today. So what I want you to see here is that in order for the mining company to extract this ore body, right, which is still only within the yellow outline that I'm tracing with my laser pointer, the mining company, in order to go deeper and extract deeper parts of the ore body, has to extract more overburden that surrounds the ore grade rock. No copper out here, no copper out here, only copper within here. So as you go deeper, it's not the rule of thumb, as you go deeper in any open pit mine, the mine will grow larger and larger and larger radially out from the center of the pit in order to increase the depth of the pit. So if you look here at pre-mining and the mined out area today, it's a radical change, absolutely radical change. And I'll show you some data in the slides today to give you a sense of how much copper is being produced and the cost and revenue for that copper. So again, here's the ore body top left pre-mining. Only within the ore body is there copper that can be extracted and sold. And here is the open pit mine today. And notice how much overburden has been extracted in order to mine to a depth of about 1,200 meters. So here is another schematic, okay? And I'm tracing with my laser pointer on the right side what we call benches, where what engineers do is before mining begins, we have all of the rock that we've drilled out of this area that allow us to define the exact spatial position and orientation and size of the ore body. What engineers do is they assess that rock for the rock's strength. Essentially, think of it as durability. And when they know the strength of the rock, that allows them to calculate how big each one of these benches are. And the benches are where you'll see in a subsequent slide mine haul trucks are driving. How wide these benches have to be, and how tall and how steep the angle is on the wall rock here between the benches. So these benches, I'll show you here, are where we have access roads for trucks that weigh several hundred tons when they're full of ore coming out of the bottom of the pit. So there's a lot of engineering that goes into this, which also adds to the cost of the overall mining infrastructure and mining operations and maintenance. So once you have your plan in place, what do? Well, you got to move the rock. And to move the rock, what we do is we blast it. So you're looking here at an aerial view, and I'm going to highlight your eye here. I'm going to focus your eye down in the lower left. This here with my laser pointer is a drilling rig, so similar to the type of drilling rig that we talked about in Lecture 6 where we're actually drilling the core of rock. In this case, we're drilling open holes, cylinders that go down 55 feet. And each one of these holes that I'll trace, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can see that all of these holes are lined up east-west across your screen and north-south across your screen. And what happens is at each mine, there are 2 people who are certified by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, a branch of the federal government in the United States, and similar entities in countries around the world. After the holes are drilled, explosives are put in the bottom of the hole, and then the hole is blown up. And I'm going to show you a video so you can see what happens, and then I'll walk you through how that actually occurs and the sequence with which each one of the holes is detonated. So each one of those are the holes, and you can see the drill rigs. And listen to the siren. The suspense is building. All right, so this is a mine in Mexico, Zacatecas, and I'm going to turn the sound off here so I can just walk you through it. But what you're looking at here is these are the drill rigs, and if you look carefully here in the center, you can see the drill rig is spinning, right? So it's spinning and it's drilling out these holes, And the drills move on these guys that my kids always think look like something in a Star Wars movie, right? So this is some sort of mining bulldozer, and you're moving the drill rig, and then you're drilling these holes 55 feet deep. And then you've got professionals that come in, right? So here's a human for scale. So you've got professionals who come in, engineers who are trained and certified to use explosives, and they will load explosives, and then all of the explosives are connected by cables to a central command. And so all of the holes are loaded with an explosive, okay, or a charge that can be detonated. And then what happens here, when I said listen to the sound, so this sound, they're evacuating the entire open pit. So when they blast any part of the pit, they typically issue a warning sound at least 30 minutes, usually an hour before, and then it increments of every several minutes leading up to the blast. And then you could hear the countdown. So at the time when they blast this pit, there is nobody at the bottom of that pit. There's nobody on any one of these benches or haul roads. Everybody is up here, out of the pit, in the most safe place they could possibly be. And there are strict safety measures here, and most mines have a zero tolerance policy that if you violate any of these safety precautions, you will automatically be terminated. Now, remember, each one of these is a hole down here, okay? Each one of these sort of black nubs that you can see. And so I want you now, I'm going to try and play it slow enough. What I want you to see, and I'm going to keep the sound off because I want you to see this, is as I play it through, well, I guess I got to let it play. Hopefully it can catch up with me. Right, as we play it through, let me get past it. Oh, there we go. So notice that as soon as the first charges are detonated, right, and think of the explosive as a charge, notice that it doesn't get detonated evenly everywhere. The first charge that's detonated is over here on the right side of your screen at that wall, okay? And then notice that out here on the flat part of the base of the pit, this part of the open pit is detonated second. So what happens is that they blow this up strategically from one side to the other. So in this case, they blow up the right side first, then they blow up the back side second, and then the explosives move from the back to the front, pop, 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 pop. And what that does is it allows them to actually move the rock that's detonated. So notice now, okay, if we go backwards, all of the rock, as I play this through, all of the rock that's here at the bottom of the screen is going to move downhill towards us. So watch this. See how it's all being blown towards us? And that is all engineered. So that is all done so that after they detonate and they blow up this part of the mine, they can strategically come in with trucks and they can extract all of the rock that's up here. And if you ever have a chance to go to a mine when they're doing one of these, I will promise you it is a titillating experience. Just absolutely awesome. So, how do we do it? I'm not going to get into the details, except to let you know that engineers are really good at doing what they do. And one of the things that they do, I mentioned how they study the rock to understand the rock's strength. Once they know the rock's strength, what they also do is they use dynamite or explosives that is tailored for that particular type of rock. So this is based on lots of experiments in labs where different types of rock are blown up, and you can determine what's called the sonic velocity of the rock. And once you know the sonic velocity of the rock, then you use an explosive that has a detonation velocity that matches the sonic velocity so that it increases the efficiency with which you can blow up the rock. What you also do is on the right is the photograph I showed a few minutes ago where each one of these is a hole that's been drilled 55 feet from this drilling rig, and then the explosives are put in the base. All of this text boils down to the following. Imagine you have two holes And each one of these holes, you put the exact same size of dynamite at the base. Okay? We've got a hole here that's 2 inches from side to side, so this 2-inch bore hole, and we've got a hole here that's 1.5 inches diameter. This is 1.5 inches, the diameter here. What you want to do then is you want to make sure that the diameter of the hole is almost perfectly equal to the diameter of the stick of dynamite or the explosive, so that there's almost zero airspace here between the stick of dynamite and the side of the hole. Because airspace, think of it as a vacuum. It's just dead space. So the mining company wants to make sure that when they send the electric signal to detonate this charge, that when that explosion happens at the bottom of the hole, instantaneously it moves out in 3 dimensions all around the sides, above, and below, so that they increase the efficiency with which they blow up the rock. So a lot of engineering here, and that's the key to this slide. You want the diameter of the borehole that you drill to be equal to the diameter of the explosive that you load at the bottom of the hole. And then after you detonate, you might see something like this. After you detonate, now you bring in trucks, you bring in shovels, and you move that rock. And I just put here some of the cost up at the top. No need to memorize this for the exam. Just a sense of how expensive, again, mining is. Each one of these shovels here is about $20 million. Each one of them weighs about 3.2 million pounds. And if you've ever done landscaping, this bucket on the right side of the screen, that bucket contains about 56 cubic yards of material, which is almost 100 tons of rock per single scoop. And then you bring in a truck. So here we've got a shovel in the background. We've got a big haul truck in the foreground. The haul truck driver is going to pull forward and then back in. And in the background, the shovel is loading up the rock here, and then it's going to load that rock into the truck, and the truck is going to drive it up and out of the pit. And this happens at mines around the world 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They never stop unless there is inclement weather, such as a tornado or an earthquake, that causes them, because of safety concerns, to have to abort operations temporarily. So that shovel empties its load into the truck, and the truck drives up and out of the pit. And then there's always another truck right over here off the side of the screen, and the process repeats. And these trucks run all the time. So this is just an example here on the left of a truck driving up and out. And then we've got some of the mine geologists here coming down in the small truck on the right. These trucks are massive. This is a class I taught a couple of years ago in Wyoming. Here's me in the blue hard hat and the blue jacket. And this is a truck, just to give you a sense of the scale of the tires. Each one of these trucks is about $3.5 million. Again, file that away until we talk about the economics of mining. Here's just a sense of the tires. Each one of the tires is $50,000 per tire. And they run 24/7. So looking at the screen here, you can see all of these trucks on the right-hand side driving down. And on the left-hand side, all of these trucks are filled and they're driving out. And the speed limit at mines is 13 miles an hour. It's a universal speed limit. So back to this concept of overburden that I talked about earlier in the lecture today. So first I want to describe overburden. Overburden is the rock above an ore deposit and surrounding an ore deposit that contains no metal that you can sell. Nothing. No copper, no platinum, no gold, nothing. You still have to blow it up. You still have to get it out of the way. So you still have to pay for essentially mining it and taking it out of the pit so you can get to the ore body. Now, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 examples here where in each of these examples, the ore body is the same size in green at the bottom. And the question is, which of the examples shown here is more profitable, all else being equal? So we assume that each of the 4 ore bodies in green has the same total concentration of copper. Which one of the 4 is more profitable? And the answer is is the ore body on the left side of your screen. And that's because in order to extract the ore body here on the left side of the screen, we also have to extract an equal amount of overburden, but the ratio is 1 to 1. Notice as we move to the ore body here, we're extracting the same volume of ore that we did in the case on the left, but we're extracting 1, 2, 3 times as much overburden as ore. And in the case on the second to right from here, we're extracting again the same size of the ore body, but we're extracting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times as much ore rock. 6 times the amount of overburden is 6 times the amount of ore rock. And then the case on the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we're extracting 10 times as much overburden as ore. And none of this overburden can be sold for anything. Now, the ratio of the volume of overburden to the volume of ore is defined as the stripping ratio. As the stripping ratio increases, the mine profit decreases. So the stripping ratio on the left would be 1 to 1. The stripping ratio on the right would be 10 to 1. So we've got a stripping ratio of 10 on the right, 5 in the middle, 6 here on the second from right, and 3 here and 1 here. So the mine on the left has the lowest stripping ratio and the highest profit. There's a lot of engineering that you can look into, and I just want to give you some of the basics here. So if you look at the screen, here is an ore body that's a cylinder that I've schematically indicated on the screen, and this cylinder is what contains the metals that are worth money. And the surface represents the top of a cone, shown here in white, that would become the open pit. So in order to mine all of this cylinder, we have to mine all of this cone, and all of the blue on the left and all of the blue on the right are worthless. But we still have to cover the cost of detonating, digging out with a shovel, putting into a haul truck, and getting out of the pit so that we can actually get to the ore body that contains the metals that are economic. So you could ignore all of the equations here on the lower right. All I want to emphasize here is simplistically, I'm just using volume, but in reality, you would use mass, and that's because all of those trucks, they're using diesel electric engines. Diesel is something that costs money. Electricity is something that costs money, and so the mass in your truck dictates how much fuel you're going to use based on fuel economy. So that's why it would actually be more accurate than volume to use mass. But you can leave the details behind. Just remember that mass is more accurate than volume when planning mining activities because it's the mass of ore rock and overburden in the truck that factor into the overall cost of operations and maintenance of those trucks. So what happens, here's a question, what happens, this is the same schematic I showed the last couple of slides, what happens if you change the slope of the angle or the pit walls? So imagine here we've got this white line which simulates simplistically the pit walls, meaning we have an open pit that we're excavating. What happens if you change the slope? Does the stripping ratio have any impact on the economics of mining? Absolutely. I've answered that one for you. So as the stripping ratio increases, the cost of mining increase. But notice now we've got the volume of overburden. Notice that if I have an open pit that is outlined in white compared to an open pit that's outlined in red, all else being equal for the same volume of ore, the overall costs just went up. So you'd ask yourself, well, why would any mining company have a pit that is outlined in red when they could have a pit that's outlined in white? And that has to do with rock strength. Something else to notice here, as the pit becomes larger, from that outlined by the white cone to the red cone, the stripping ratio just increased, which means the cost of mining just increased and the profitability decreased. What about the impact? I just said it. As the size of the pit increases and becomes wider and you're mining more overburden, it's less profitable. So here are a couple of slides just to emphasize First, rock strength. So the stronger the rock is, imagine you're digging a pit that's outlined in red versus a pit that's outlined in green. If you have rock that is strong and you can have a pit outlined in red, that means that you're extracting less overburden than if you have a rock that is weaker and you have to have the open pit outlined in green. So greater rock strength allows you to build steeper benches, which means that you reduce the overall amount of overburden. So you have, as I say here, a lower stripping ratio and less waste rock, which means that it's overall cheaper and more profitable. And if you have a greater final pit depth, so here we're comparing red versus green, the rule of thumb is that the deeper you go, the wider you have to go, and the stripping ratio will increase. So there's a lot that goes into mining engineering from an economic perspective, because remember that ultimately the only way any mining company can extract ore grade rock from an ore body below the surface of the earth is if they make a profit. So what do you do with all of that overburden that you have to detonate, explode, lift with a shovel, put in a truck? All of that overburden gets trucked out of the open pit and stored permanently somewhere else. It never gets put back into the open pit. And that's because it would cost money to drive that overburden back into the bottom of the pit after the mining operations cease at the end of the life of the mine. So when you look around the world, these are just a couple of snapshots. Here's a mine in Australia, and all of this on the right-hand side in the top, these are all mountains of overburden that have been extracted from an open pit mining operation. Here's another one. This is a large diamond mine in Russia, where all of this open pit that I'm tracing with the laser pointer, all of that rock, that overburden, is now the mountains you can see here in the central part of your screen and the lower right-hand side of your screen. Those aren't mountains of snow. Those are snow-covered mountains of rock. And this town here exists only for the purpose of digging that hole deeper to mine diamonds. Here is an example from Bingham Canyon outside Salt Lake City. So if you ever drive from Las Vegas to Salt Lake City, if you're passing the IKEA just south of Salt Lake City and you look off to the west, you'll see all of these large volumes of overburden. These are mountains of overburden that have been extracted from Bingham Canyon since 1906. So I've mentioned the metals of antiquity, and here are four of them again: gold, copper, silver, lead, and iron. I've talked now about overburden. I've talked about the stripping ratio, which is the ratio of the amount of overburden divided by the amount of ore grade rock. And I want to show you here, just as an example, if you focus lower right, in this histogram, the amount in yellow is the amount of ore grade rock from which we can extract a metal. The amount in sort of a darker brown is the amount of what's called here waste rock, which is overburden. And notice that as we move from left to right, if you look at the y-axis, it's in millions of tons. On average, when you're mining an ore body that contains iron, about half of what you actually have to extract and mine is waste rock or overburden, and about half is iron. Look at what happens with copper. To get this much copper just at the top, you have to extract all of this overburden, right? So we're extracting 11 million tons of overburden to get about 1 million tons of copper. With gold, it's even less gold and more overburden. Zinc, lead, aluminum is a little better, and remember, aluminum is bauxite. Manganese, nickel, tin, and tungsten. So the takeaway for this slide is that at any open pit mine around the world, and most underground mines, but more so true for open pit mines, mining companies are extracting a lot more waste rock or overburden than they are the rock that actually contains the metal that makes mining operations economic. I'm going to introduce something here called the economy of scale, and we'll come back and hit the economics in more detail in a future lecture. But I just want to give you a sense of what I mean by economy of scale. So the Bingham Canyon mine in Utah is the world's largest man-made excavation. It's now a little more than 4,000 meters in diameter and 1,200 meters depth, or 4 kilometers by 1.2 kilometers. The ore grade rock, so only the ore grade rock, contains about half a weight percent copper, or 5,000 parts per million copper. Each metric ton therefore contains about 5 kilograms of copper. To mine 1 ton of ore grade rock requires also mining 2 tons of barren rock. And that barren rock or waste rock we call overburden. So the mining company is paying to move a lot of waste rock out of the way to get to the ore grade rock or the ore deposit. Remember that ratio of overburden to ore grade rock is called the stripping ratio. The price of copper, at least the futures price of copper, today is May 11th, 2020, and when I looked at the futures stock market in Asia today, the price of copper is $2.38 per pound. So per pound of actual metal copper at the end of all the mining operations that the company can sell is $2.38 per pound, or $1.08 per kilogram. At that price, Bingham Canyon has to move and mine 2 tons of overburden and process 1 ton of ore in order to earn a gross revenue of $14.28. Now, what does that mean by gross revenue? I'll come back in a future lecture and talk about taxes, but imagine that as your total paycheck, before taxes, before anything is deducted, no retirement plan, nothing. They're moving 3 tons of rock and extracting that copper to earn $14.28. Last year, Bingham Canyon produced 233,000 tons of copper, which is about 233 million kilograms, or 512 million pounds of copper, which, as I say here, holy moly, that's a lot of copper. And the value of that copper in today's price is $251,640,000. So that's what I mean by the economy of scale. The only way that the mining company can make a profit from mining this giant open pit mine is by mining millions of tons of ore rock and waste rock every single year to extract a significant quantity of copper. Last year alone, 233,000 tons that can generate revenues of hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's what allows them to mine. The only way to do that economically is with a large open pit mine, where you have economy of scale working in your favor. So a few slides here just to give you an indication, since Bingham Canyon started at the early part of the 20th century, of how copper mining has changed. On the left side of the screen, the y-axis is millions of tons, and on the x-axis we've got time. And the line that I'm showing you here is cumulative copper production worldwide. So if we go back to 1930, 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, 80, 90, 2000, this is cumulative copper production globally, and you can see that it's increased. Now, there's a lot of empty space here. Why is there all that empty space? Because one of the things that has happened over the last century, if we go back to 1930, okay, on the right-hand side, I've now got a second y-axis that's the average copper ore grade. And remember that ore grade is the concentration of copper in the rock that defines or constitutes the ore body, the ore deposit. So if we go back to 1930, mining companies were mining rock where the rock contained on average almost 2 weight percent copper. Notice that over the last century, the grade or the concentration of copper in ore rock has systematically decreased, and today, globally, mining companies are mining rock that contains about 0.6 weight percent copper. So in 100 years, we've mined all the low-hanging fruit, all of the copper-rich ore bodies around the world that used to contain close to 2 weight percent copper. We've mined those out, And now we're mining copper from ore bodies at lower grade. So a question, if the grade of copper being mined is decreasing, how can the total amount of mined copper be increasing, right? If I go back here and you say, well, wait a minute, how can the grade of copper decrease? Meaning globally, all of the mines right now actively mining copper, their grade or copper concentration is decreasing. And that's a lot of decrease. But how can we then be producing more copper? It's because we're mining a lot more rock. So now I have this dark bold line, and that shows you the total amount of ore rock in millions of tons that we're mining annually around the world. And what I want you to see is that if we look at the bottom, it is absolutely true that year over year we're mining more copper, right? That's a positive slope on this cumulative copper production line. But notice that in order to produce more copper year over year from ore bodies that contain less copper, because the grade is decreasing, we have to mine more and more and more and more ore bodies to satisfy global demand. So, just a few slides on engineering and failures. And the question here is, does all the engineering prevent failures? And I want to give you a sense of how engineers at operating mines actually forecast and monitor for the prevention of a failure, because they happen. So here is the open pit mine at Bingham Canyon, and here is a slope failure that happened in 2013. So here is pre-failure, and here is post-failure. Here we have on the lower left all of the mine infrastructure, all of the offices, and then you can see the slope failed here on the left-hand side and essentially created an avalanche where all of this rock here instantaneously, gravitationally avalanched to the bottom of the open pit. No one died. The entire pit was evacuated hours before this happened. So there were a lot of mine trucks that ended up being avalanched to the bottom because they got caught up in all of this rock that was dislodged, but nobody died. How? Right? How do you prevent failures in a mine? So here is where technology at mining companies is the same type of technology that we use in driverless cars. Pretty amazing. And I'm going to show you a video in case you're not familiar with that, so you get a sense of how geologists at operating mines predict and reduce the potential for fatalities during a landslide.
My name is Wolfgang Juchmann. I'm with Velodyne, and what you see here is the Ford Fusion hybrid research vehicle having 4 Velodyne HDL32s on the top. This is to investigate self-driving or assisted driving and generate maps that support that kind of activity. The sensor itself has a range of about 100 meters, 32 laser detector pairs, and it's actually doing 3D measurements, 360 degrees, up to 20 times per second, to generate 700,000 data points per second. The images that you get out of that, you can see on that screen in the background there, out of these sensors. Let me go over there and I can see me walking here. Actually, the guy here. You see the car, you see the environment of the car. And the beauty is really that you can see 360 degrees to the front, to the back, to the right, left, 80, 100 meters out. Maybe a little bit about the history of the sensor.
All right, so I'll stop it there and I'll let you look that up on your own time if you want. But all I wanted you to see here is that the way driverless cars work is they have these sensors on the car, and these sensors are spinning incredibly fast, and they're sending beams of light out in all directions. So you have multiple sensors around the entire car. And what happens is those beams of light get sent out, and when they hit an object, they get reflected back to a sensor, and that tells the car, oh shit, there's something over there we have to avoid. So then they work to move the car or stop the car. This technology is referred to as LiDAR, light detection and ranging. And LiDAR has become a standard technique that mining companies use to measure the size of an open pit, effectively the volume of an open pit, and also underground mines. And just a little bit of the basics here on the bottom left, and Google this if you want to. The technology absolutely blows me away. You've got a sender and a receiver. Okay, so imagine this is on your car or it's on this instrument, and the instrument sends out a wave, okay, of light, and then when it hits an object, it bounces back, shown in green, and is reflected back to the sensor. And what happens is that the instrument can measure the distance from the front of the sender to the object based on the wave traveling from the sender to the receiver, the sender to the object, and then back to the receiver. So at open pit mines, this is an example where false color imaging shows you the volume of an open pit that has essentially been mapped using LiDAR. And so the mine geologists and engineers know the exact diameter of the pit in every direction down to sub-millimeter precision. And what they do, back up one step, what they do then is they monitor in real time every second of every minute of every hour of every day. And as soon as they detect any anomalous movement on one side of the pit or another, they evacuate the mine. So in the case of the Bingham Canyon open pit, if I go backwards, they were using LiDAR to measure constantly the diameter of the pit, and then they were able to issue a warning and evacuate the mine so no fatalities were suffered or no fatalities occurred during that landslide or slope pit failure. And there's lots of this you can read about LiDAR. It's used in engineering and geosciences. It's used by the auto industry. Really, really interesting and exciting technology. So I encourage you to read about this in your own time if you want to. Okay, so let's transition now to underground mining. So how would you mine this volume of rock? Right? We've got a pancake that's roughly vertical with respect to the Earth's surface. Nobody, no how, nowhere, no way is going to get financing to build a big open pit to mine this, because all of this overburden would have to be mined, and all of this overburden would have to be mined. So no bank on the planet is going to loan the money for that. You'd have to mine it underground. And I want to just give you some of the basics of underground mining, because it's slightly different than an open pit, where in an open pit you're starting from the surface. In an underground mine, you're building what we call elevator shafts, so follow my laser pointer, and you have elevator shafts, and then from each one of these elevator shafts, you build what are called adits, or you can think of them as tunnels off of the elevator shaft. And what mining companies do is they can mine at different levels from these elevator shafts. There are some underground mines where, as shown here in the center, they actually dig and drill tunnels, and then you can drive down these tunnels underground. Okay, so two different ways of accomplishing the same task. You're essentially digging tunnels and or elevator shafts, and then you have these adits or shafts here where you have your engineers and geologists and equipment that mine the ore body. So here was the ore body in black, and notice that we'd never build a big open pit because there's too much overburden, but now we can build an underground infrastructure. And the same types of detonation are also done underground, because underground you actually still have to blast and disaggregate the ore body. But one of the things that is different is that in underground mines, the companies can strategically target the ore body so that they minimize the amount of overburden. So the overall cost of mining is higher, and you keep that cost low by trying to only mine the ore grade rock. So this is a photograph I took in an underground mine, and this is actually a drill rig where they're extracting the rock. And here's a geologist on the right-hand side looking at the rock in real time. And the way that you mine underground is you essentially tunnel through like a worm, where you follow the ore body, moving left, moving right, moving up, moving down. So you're only extracting the ore grade rock. So I'll play a video here for you just to give you a sense of the way that that's done underground.
Can we shut off the bottom fan so we can hear the delays? Where's the electrician?
In 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire in the hole!
All right. I get goosebumps when I see that. And if I just play that through again right here, and I'll turn off, well, actually, I'll keep the sound on. Right? What you can see, those are the explosives. And again, notice here that when they detonate the charges, they're strategically detonating them, right? It's not all equal everywhere, that they start on one side and then they progressively move throughout the ore body so that you can focus the blast in such a way that you reduce the amount of stress that you put on the rock that surrounds the ore body. And now you've just created a huge amount of disaggregated rock underground. And then you bring in your geologists and engineers, and they put what you can think of as concrete on the roof, and you dig out the tunnel by removing that ore rock, and you bring it to the surface. Now, globally, there are a lot of underground mines, and ultimately the limit for underground mining is the heat. So if you look at the schematic on the left, we've got depth in kilometers on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis. The deepest mines in the world are in South Africa. They're gold mines, and they are a little more than 3 kilometers deep, or a little more than 3,000 meters deep. And at that depth, the temperature in the mine is in excess of 150 degrees. So they have to be cooled with cold saltwater solutions that are piped down. So in terms of underground mining, there's a lot of metals that could be mined at 10, 50, 100 kilometers deep, but right now we have no technology that allows us to go that deep to mine them. So it's the temperature that really restricts our ability to mine deeper in the Earth's crust. Okay, so what do you do when you're finished? Just a few slides here about reclamation. So I've had in a couple of slides and didn't mention it, this concept of pumping. Whenever you're mining by an open pit or you're building an underground infrastructure, you're mining below what we call the water table. So all I want you to think about is that here is an open pit mine that has now been reclaimed. And by reclaimed, I mean it's no longer being mined. And it's filled with water, and that water is natural. So during mining, the company had to actually pay to constantly pump that water out. So one of the things that we know does not happen is mining companies never put the waste rock back into the pit because it's economically implausible. It just wouldn't allow them to be profitable. So most open pit mines become lakes, and I'll talk in a subsequent lecture about the environmental impacts that that can have. But it's often the case that, if not always the case, that all of that overburden remains in perpetuity on the surface, and mining companies, as you'll see in a future lecture, are required to line the ground surface so that there can be no leaching of metals from the overburden into the surrounding area. This is heavily regulated, so within the United States, we have what's called the Office of Surface Mining, and there's the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. It was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1977, mostly for coal, but it also applies to other mines. And one of the things that this requires is after mining operations cease, mining companies have to replant with native vegetation the entire mine infrastructure, and then they have to monitor that vegetation in perpetuity. They often have to collect water samples on the surface and from groundwater. So this reclamation is also a cost to the mining companies. Here are some mines. If you drive up to the Upper Peninsula, you'll see that these mines are no longer operating, the infrastructure is essentially decaying, and the open pits are filling with water. So these represent a potential environmental hazard, and the mining companies are required to post bonds that allow federal and state and local government agencies to monitor for negative impacts to the environment in perpetuity. And again, I'll come back and talk about that in more detail. So here's another one of these mines in northern Michigan. So, last few slides for this lecture, I promise. I know it's been a long haul. To tie the lecture to discussion. So here's a map on the left of South America. Here's the country Chile. So Chile, I spend a lot of time in Chile. Here's the capital city of Santiago. And I've had a number of graduate students who have done research projects on mining, on mines in this part of the world. And this is an area, this is a mine called Chuquicamata, which has been in operation since 1913. And it is one of the largest open pit mines on planet Earth. This is what it looks like from space. Okay? It measures about 5 kilometers long ways and about 2 kilometers across. It's got a phenomenal amount of overburden. You can see these overburdened mountains around the open pit. In 2017, after mining for more than 100 years, they stopped digging the pit and they started building an underground infrastructure because they could no longer dig the pit deeper without going wider, and that was uneconomic. And now they're going underground where they can target the copper-rich ore-grade rock and reduce the amount of overburden, and they anticipate mining for another 100 years. But this is what I want you to see. Chile is a country that in the northern part of Chile has no local source of fuel. There's no coal, there's no natural gas, there's no oil. So all of the electricity has to be generated by importing fossil fuels, or what you see here. In the background is actually Chuquicamata on a hazy day, and Chuquicamata invested in all of these wind turbines that are now being partnered with all of these solar panels to generate the electricity. So as you work through your modules 3 and 4, focused on building a renewable energy wind plus solar infrastructure for the University of Michigan and Southeast Michigan, just know that this is now the reality for mining companies around the world. And the reason is economics. The cheapest way to generate electricity is a combination of wind and solar and local grid-scale battery storage. And you'll learn about those details in a future module, and I'll come back and focus on this in lecture. So that's it. That is mining open pit and underground in a nutshell. And we will, in lecture 8, start talking about what we do with the ore grade rock when we bring it back to the surface.